Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to the Miscellaneous Film Festival podcast. Just wanted to let you all know up front, we get into some dark topics in this one, specifically Nazi war crimes and suicide. So if that's something you'd rather not listen to right now, I completely understand, and I hope you'll go check out one of our other episodes. And now, on with the show. Welcome to the Miscellaneous Film Festival, the podcast for curiously curated films. I'm Jason.
And I'm Christen.
And this week we're talking to our friend Dustin Bartolucci about movies close to his heart. Welcome, Dustin.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. You are an encyclopedia of movie knowledge. You rattle off layered jokes and references so fast. It's really exciting to have you here, man.
I appreciate it, but I'm actually still totally an amateur. I know way more about Tarkovsky than I've actually seen his movies. I've seen 3. I've got 4 more to go.
So tell us about the 5 movies you've brought to share with us tonight.
You can kind of think about them as just commentaries on different aspects of the human condition, which I know is like the broadest topic of any art ever. And I arranged them to go from light to super dark, and that kind of betrays my actual personality. I'm actually an optimist by nature.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I'm naive about it. There's plenty of things wrong. But I think dwelling on darkness can be both good and bad. I think art's the best way to do it, whereas watching the news is like the worst way to do it. And that goes into one of our movies. But so I chose the Scorsese movie After Hours, completely unknown nowadays. Like it was kind of a flop when it came out, kind of like King of Comedy. This is a part of his kind of duology of 2 just like freaked out New York style dark comedies. It's very Talking Heads humor.
I gotta admit, when I saw the cover for this movie, which it's just looks like a stopwatch with the guy's head being twisted for the timer, I realized I've seen this a lot of times at video stores, but had never checked it out, and I was assuming it was going to be a screwball comedy or something with Tom Hanks in it from the era.
Right.
But no.
It completely betrays that cover.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then after that, we're watching Watched Network, which is by Sidney Lumet. I think it's in competition for his best movie, the other one being Dog Day Afternoon. Same exact era. It's like they're like in the same year, I think, or maybe one year after another. So it's just like one of those great Hollywood classics, but it's criminally underwatched. I think its best like quotes are well known publicly, but it's one of those things where like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, everyone knows the surf guitar music more than they've actually seen the movie. And Network is this brilliant commentary on mainstream news media, and honestly now non-mainstream media, which we'll get into. And then after that it goes, I would say, more individualistic, more personal, with Jacob's Ladder. Adrian Lyne, super cool director. He did a better version of Lolita, even though I love Kubrick's version. And Fatal Attraction's like his most famous movie. But Jacob's Ladder stars Tim Robbins. I think it's his best role. And like a super emotional gravitas from him. I care very deeply about him in that movie. It's essentially the journey at the end of your life is how I'd put it. And then it goes just more religious from there with the next movie, which is Silence. Another Scorsese movie. I could have picked 5 Scorsese movies that I think are just underwatched. Silence came out, 2016? And it essentially had no fanfare. It bombed financially, which it was destined to do. You know, the same thing happened to Kundun, which is also very good. But Silence, I think, deserves elevation. And we'll talk a lot about religion with that movie in particular. And then the last movie I picked is using favorite or love are persnickety with this movie, but I actually do think it's my favorite movie of all time now. I've seen it twice, and it's not super rewatchable.
No.
I'm not as traumatized as others are about it, but it's deeply affecting, is how I would put it. And art that moves you to that extent, no matter how dark, I think requires some like place on a pedestal. And there's also a non-literariness about it that I really like. It actually has a lot of abstractions, especially in the first half, and then it becomes more concretized as it goes forward. I think Come and See is the most emotionally affecting movie ever made that I have seen, and I would say people that have a hard time, I think everyone should attempt this, but if they're looking for a way to dip the toe in the water, Schindler's List or Grave of the Fireflies or Plague Dogs, they should, if they can't make it through those, they won't make it through Come and See.
Absolutely.
But it has everything in it. It is a kind of warped, inverted hero's journey, actually.
It is.
Even though it's still the hero's journey.
Yeah.
But it's the very, very dark, take on it.
Yeah.
even though there is light at the end of the tunnel.
So I would
That's
say,
one of my favorite things about Dustin, though, is like if you spend time with him, you wouldn't know how much dark art he like spends time in. You're like one of the sunniest people that I know.
Yeah, and I have other favorite movies, but I really wanted to go hard on the neglectedness criteria. I think these movies are simply neglected. To answer your question about the sequencing of my list, I figured, well, it has to be rank ordered somehow, because if you put Come and See first, it just destroys the rest of the list, right?
I agree.
You can't watch that movie first and then like watch a lighthearted comedy with any enthusiasm.
Yeah.
Right. And what I noticed going through these in the order you suggested, a theme, I don't think this is what you were going for, seemed to be of kind of an Alice in Wonderland journey down the rabbit hole. If somebody gets isolated and someone experiences a world completely different than their own, except for network.
Yeah,
so
I'm a kind of like amateur economist. I spend a lot of my time reading economics because it's way more interesting than politics, and it actually tells you how the world works rather than just what's happening. And I think the four that you mentioned, the ones that are not network, they're all like the micro view. Network is like a macro view of this. Howard Beale's a kind of prophet for people to follow in that way. So yes, and I'm a big fan of the hero's journey, but I think that it gets often just bastardized in the academic system. Like if you go to college, screenwriter school, whatever, you learn the 3-act structure, you shall not break these rules, and then you get very uninteresting stories. But then you go back and read the real heroes' journeys, and they're incredible, right? Like Excalibur or Lord of the Rings, right? Like so many.
It was never meant to be a formula. That's the problem, I think.
And I do think that most stories, you can abstract them to it, but it gets looser and looser, and that's fine.
Once you try, like you just wind up with very cookie cutter kind of things like that.
Right. It's like listening to like a great piece of Schoenberg music. Incredible composer, very misunderstood. People treat him as like the destroyer of classical music. If anything, he understood it better than any of his contemporaries. There is a form to his pieces, but it's not the same form that you would get from Mozart or Beethoven or Bach. So
yes, I feel the same way. I also
I thought that you would.
Yeah.
If you'd like to listen to Schoenberg, the 5 pieces for orchestra, they're all 3 minutes or less, and they're wild and crazy.
I think I will learn how to spell Schoenberg and look up some of his music to play at the end of this episode.
If you can spell Schwarzenegger, you're already there. And I learned how to spell that at 8.
So let's dive in. Let's get into the first movie, After Hours, from 1985, directed by Martin Scorsese, starring Griffin Dunne. The story is basically desperate to escape his mind-numbing routine, uptown Manhattan office worker Paul Hackett ventures downtown and into an unpredictable world of New York after hours.
So Griffin Dunne, he's going to be most well known for American Werewolf in London as the person who gets killed at the very beginning.
That's
Zombie
where
best
he's
friend.
from.
Yeah, and he's wonderful in this movie.
When I was reading just Wikipedia about After Hours, it seemed like everybody at the time, everybody in 1985 who was doing anything big in filmmaking, was touching this movie somehow.
Yes.
Like Spielberg was potentially tapped to direct this, and I think he pass it up to give it to Martin Scorsese?
From what I remember reading, your memory's probably fresher than mine, but I know that Scorsese eventually warmed to the script, and it's because he was having a hell of a time getting Last Temptation of Christ filmed. People kept giving him the runaround. And I think that there's a lot of that kind of anxiety in this movie, right? Like running back and forth to person, and they're not quite understanding where you're coming from.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like kind of societal alienation as the big theme in it.
Mm-hmm.
That's wild. You would not link those two, but now that you have, I can absolutely see the parallels there.
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on there. And what's interesting? So I've read a lot about people talking about the office worker thing. I agree that he's in kind of a repetitive job. There's even the line that the guy says at the beginning of the movie where he's like, "Oh, I don't want to be a word processor. I have bigger ideas." Right? Like
he's about to quit.
Yeah.
As soon as he has another.
He commits a social faux pas on Griffin Dunne and it offends him. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But then at the end of the movie, after this kind of Minotaur maze nightmare that he goes through, it's actually the place where he has some sort of predictability and stability. So yeah, maybe I'll get into like what happens in this movie.
Well, it's a guy goes downtown because
thinking he'll get a date.
Well, he first goes downtown just to read a book.
Yes.
And the girl approaches him.
Yes.
Great start. And gives him her number.
Yes.
And he decides to follow through on it and try and meet up with her and probably hook up.
I mean, it was 99%.
Yeah. Absolutely.
He was not actually interested in getting to know this woman at all.
Right.
He was just like looking for his first opportunity.
Right.
Which is why I personally am of two minds about this movie, but keep going.
I knew that this would affect you that way. Yeah.
I agree with Kristen. I spent this whole movie I spent like the first half of the movie being like red flag, red flag, red flag.
This guy.
Well,
this guy sucks. And
I was doing red flag of the ladies.
The lady was clearly traumatized, but there he was trying to get laid anyway.
Oh, she was going hot and cold.
Yeah, like for obvious reasons, there was something going on there.
Yeah, which to me that's a red flag. Like, hey, you're not here. Your intentions are not to be her friend.
Yeah,
you don't know her.
Yep.
You can bail and let her take care of herself. Also, she shouldn't rely on you. Yeah. She doesn't know you.
Yeah.
And you're not get out.
Yeah.
But the second half of the movie, I was like, it's starting to feel a little misogynistic. Yes. Like, why are all the women...
That's like half of my notes.
like nightmare women who...
that are just like overly reacting to everything that he does in like really weird ways.
And not giving him sex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's... The movie tries to punish him for sticking around long enough and then just bailing on her when he thinks that she's all scarred up. Which is fucked up. At least that's how it reads to me.
Oh, yeah.
But then the second half of the movie switches around because the waitress with the beehive hairdo is insane.
Terry Garr, yeah.
Who's the other one that he runs into with
Catherine
like the
O'Hara.
ice cream truck? Catherine O'Hara with a fucking blonde. Like, have we ever seen Catherine O'Hara
cool.
blonde? Yeah, and then she's also insane, and like there's like a weird unforgivableness to the way that they're writing women. So
right.
I love the idea of it, but I think the movie drove me fucking insane. And I wonder if you figured I would say this because you got this expression.
I did, and like I love you, Chris. You're totally wrong on this.
I love you too.
No,
and I'm like, yeah, we're gonna disagree on this one.
The gender in this movie, I don't think matters at all. Actually, beyond his initial interest in the first woman,
guys are mostly sympathetic, though.
Yeah,
guys are mostly sympathetic.
Yeah, because listen, the bartender, he's a male, he's nuts as well, and there's also a guy at the nightclub who's nuts, the one that wants him to like shave his head to get in.
It was Mohawk Night.
No, what it was Insano Night for everybody in that part of town. Even the guy who runs the diner, isn't it Dick Miller? I think he's...
No, he was he's credited as a waiter, but yes, it was Dick Miller. I was so happy to see Dick Miller. I was like, things are going off the rail. We need bucket of blood. We need bucket of blood.
Yes, we need to take 10 seconds to appreciate the magic of Dick Miller. And he deserved to be in every movie ever.
And the fact that Paul Hackett gets encased in a statue at the end, just like in Bucket of Blood.
Yes.
Oh,
and,
okay.
And it's more or less...
it was just a callback in the movie itself.
To the papier-mâché thing.
Yeah.
Yes. And even the Cheech and Chong characters, they're running around doing their thing. And so, no, I actually think that there's very little gender commentary in this movie.
Yeah, we're going to have to agree to disagree.
I think the literalist read of it is not what to get out of it, actually. I think that the real thing is the anxiety of being the way that you communicate or try to express yourself to people is so alienated to where it just falls completely on deaf ears. And that's the part that I like in this movie because it's a universalist point.
Yeah.
We could have cast Griffin Dunn as a female character and the story would have worked just the same. And probably actually better for you.
That part would have worked way better for me if Jason does not agree.
No, a young lady who goes downtown and meets a guy and is bouncing from one guy to another, there'd be a high level of anxiety in that narrative, but also definitely a subtext of much more potential harm.
There's a reason I carry mace on me. I haven't had to use it yet.
Griffin Dunn always seems like he should. That's why I say red flag, red flag. He should be leaving those situations sooner,
right?
But he doesn't because he's partially being led by his dick, and that's what drives him to stay longer, to give everyone a little bit more credit, to be kind of sympathetic, when he shouldn't. When he could save himself a whole lot of trouble, just get $20 or get cab fare somehow,
right?
Get out of there at any point in the night. But then he keeps letting himself be led to the next situation. And the motivating factor that drives the story is fucking his dick.
That's true.
I don't agree, actually.
Okay.
I think that the reason he sticks around outside of the first woman, which I forgot her character name, but outside of her, he's just desperate for some kind of shelter. I don't think sex is on his mind at all by the time he gets to Terry Garr and Catherine O'Hara. And of course, there's the male prostitute that's a hilarious part of the movie, where he recounts his night, thinking, and the male prostitute thinks that he's like propositioning him, right? Like he's trying to buy his services, and he's not. He's just looking for a roof over his head at that point. So no, I think that if we can stick with the metaphor, I think the dick shrinks pretty quick after the first woman, and he's just desperate. Because even the cab driver, like, there's zero charity that any of these people actually end up giving him.
Yeah, this is where I feel like I didn't jive with the movie, in part because of what I've described, but also what you're describing is the movie that I wish that I'd seen. Because I've had those like late night wandering around from situation to situation things.
Right.
And sometimes it's like you were describing, Jason, where it's like I'm kind of tenuously making sure that I'm not about to get axe murdered and put in a dumpster. But also it can be a trip and a half. Like you can stumble on these crazy like magical, cities have a billion things going on at night.
Oh yeah.
Right.
And it can be totally random things. And I think that's what I was hoping it would be. And when it wasn't, I was like, oh man, I want to rewrite this so that it's like that. But
honestly, I think it's there, Chris.
I don't know, that's not like, I've had nights in Portland where I'm up till 3-4 a.m.
Right.
Just stumbling from like some random concert out on a street corner somewhere to like some little party with like balloons being bounced all over, like that feel more like a magical, enjoyable kind of thing. This movie feels insane.
It is
like
insane. It's a movie about anxiety.
It's supposed to be an anxiety show, for sure.
It is.
Yeah.
And that's, now that you pointed it out, I'm like, okay, I see it.
Yeah.
I get that
and
part.
I find anxiety humor to be absolutely hilarious. A lot of my favorite comedies happen to be super darkly tinged.
Oh, it's farce.
Oh, totally.
It's everything. I was looking. My initial notes for this were, I would call this a comedy of chaos or anxiety comedy. And the more I looked into it, like, that's just what farce is.
Yeah.
It's just a mounting catastrophe with things going worse and worse and worse.
Yeah. And I genuinely thought that he would die at the end for a moment.
I actually appreciated that he didn't.
Me too.
Like there was a kind of,
because that would have been like the darkest cherry on top.
Too easy.
Yeah, it would not have been palatable.
Yeah.
I do feel for the guy a lot, actually.
Yeah.
What I read was that there was not an ending for the longest time as they were developing it, working on it, and even filming it. And part of where him being encased in paper mache at the end, and then just falling out of the back of a truck, breaking himself out of the paper mache and returning to work.
Yes.
Was just the quickest way to wrap it up. I really thought that ending worked. It was a callback.
I love it.
We circled back around. It was like the perfect fairy tale journey.
Yep.
But I also felt like nothing got resolved. And that's why it was just supposed to be a farce. An anxiety thing where we just need to complete the circle.
Right. Yeah. I spoke with another friend of mine about this movie, and he actually wants to interpret it kind of literally, where he actually entered into a magical realm. But that's like the people that say that Mulholland Drive's a parallel universe. I'm like, no. This is like dream logic.
Yeah, and it's always such a bummer when people want to interpret it in those very stereotypical ways.
I think there's just a certain amount of people that don't want to let their literalism go. And that's fine, but I think that there's a lot more richness if you allow abstraction.
100%.
And with After Hours, I also... I think that there's a little bit of Carl Jung at the end where like he steps out into something that is outside of his kind of comfortable, predictable life, right? He steps into a kind of a dark circle and experiences that. And it goes completely wrong for him. He's completely unprepared for what's happening, right? The cab driver screws him over when it could just be super easy, to drive him back home or halfway uptown or whatever, and just pay him back later. But... because his money flies right out the car, right?
I mean,
I don't think
that would be easy.
Take
and that's where your optimism and joy
shows.
You're showing your hand of like, cab drivers can be nice.
Oh, I said can be. Listen,
you did say can be.
There's a whole probability distribution here, and it doesn't look good for Griffin Dunn. But the thing that I see toward his character very often in though is complete lack of charity. And almost a disinterest in even what his point of view is. And I think that's why lived experience is both a good thing and a bad thing when you bring it as an audience member into a movie. Lived experience can color the layers of the movie that you're watching and actually reduces them down. So I'm actually someone who tries to be, I mean, Chris may have told you this, I might be overly analytical. And I mean, partially that's my job. I'm a computer programmer, but so I'm not too different from Griffin Dunn. He was a word processor, right. But lived experience is, I think, extremely important. But I actually think the point of art is to get other people's experiences rather than injecting necessarily your own. I actually don't think the movie's that cynical.
You don't?
No, like it's definitely pissed off. But Patty Chayefsky actually has solutions for the people in the audience. They just don't like it. And
well, this is network. I'm
so
sorry.
We're already into it.
I'm sorry.
You're looking for a segue, baby. Here we go.
We've already segued.
The segue is you're already there.
That's right.
Have you not seen After Hours? You're already there. No, we're talking about Network from 1976, which was directed by Sidney Lumet, starring Faye Dunaway and Peter Finch. I thought a good summary for this was, amongst shakeups in a major news network, veteran anchorman Howard Beale announces to viewers that he will kill himself during his farewell broadcast, which sort of perpetuates a spiral of events in the network. And I would say cynicism is a huge color in the palette of this movie. About
I actually don't think the movie's that cynical.
You don't?
No. Like it's definitely pissed off. But Patty Chayefsky actually has solutions for the people in the audience. They just don't like it. So I guess it's important to note that Patty Chayefsky, the writer, he actually had final cut on this. So he was very hand in hand with Sidney Lumet on this. And it may be Lumet. I might be just wrong for the last 10 years. But because I've never heard his name pronounced. So let's use both and see what happens.
Lumet.
Yeah, Patty Chayefsky, like prolific writer in Hollywood at the time, or had been. Like he wrote a ton in the 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. This was one of the last things he did. The last movie he ever did was Altered States, the William Hurt movie. He was definitely upset. Most of the writing he had done in his career was television writing. He's kind of in that world with this script, right? Like network television. Yeah, this movie has a lot of cynicism in it, I'd say. But I think the actual... Well, maybe we should get into this. So Howard Beale, yes, he tells the audience that he's going to kill himself. He has become very myopic with his career, and due to low ratings. Mm-hmm. And him saying that he'll commit suicide, it gets him in trouble with his boss, or maybe not his boss, but the president of the network. And his actual boss is William Holden, who's a more or less supporter of his the whole movie.
Fantastic.
He is wonderful in this. He is so good. Maybe it's worth saying everybody in this movie is at like peak level of their careers.
Yeah.
Faye Dunaway, it's my favorite role of hers along with Chinatown, and my actual favorite actress from the whole era. And like I wish she had done more.
Yeah.
And so Howard Beale in fact gets a lot of high ratings, and there's a lot of demand, for him to be back on the air. So I view Howard Beale as a kind of Shakespearean fool, where he is the truth teller to the Emperor of No Clothes.
Got it.
But the funny part, though, is the Emperor of No Clothes in this movie is the audience. It's not any particular figure, because when he finally gets his own show and it becomes popular and successful, his big sermon to the audience is, we're in the state of the world that we're in now because you people don't read books. And I know it's on the nose, but it's wrapped up in, again, this kind of New York nervous dark humor that I just relish in.
I feel like it had to be on the nose, too, because I think if you couched it in any sort of subtlety there, it would have been easier to miss.
Yes, and he is a prophet on television, and it should be on the nose.
Yeah, and it's also important that that's what makes the ratings dive, right? Like, people they want to hear the stuff that, like, gets them excited, but the stuff that hits too close to home, they don't want to know.
Exactly. What I love about Network, though, yes, it makes this... It's not even a prediction. I think it's always been with us with human nature, where... You tell people you're why the world is the way it is, and people have limited bandwidth to accept that much responsibility. Like you try to sell someone a huge moral or ethical framework, and they're just like, that's way too much to commit to. And we'll get into that with Silence, by the way. But I think that a lot of people, they're told, here's what you can do to make the world better. And they just hate the advice, right? Because it's like, I have my kids to take care of. I need to feed my household. My car needs to be repaired because of an oil leak. So
that's something that I really appreciate about the movie, in part because they seem to want real quote unquote TV, where like they actually, I think, partially want Howard to blow his brains out on air.
Yes.
But they also don't want it if it gets real for them, which is very, very true.
It's a very arm's length kind of realism that the audience craves.
Realism as entertainment, which is exactly why we've gotten as fucked up as we have.
Yes. And then, of course, there's the kind of viciousness of the network itself.
Yeah.
So Faye Dunaway is this almost anti-human character, right? Mm-hmm. She is her job. Mm-hmm. And kind of like the career woman, but taken to the nth degree. And it's unrealistic, but the point is, like, your job is like devouring you and others around you.
Mm-hmm. Well, and everybody in the movie can be seen functionally. Like, she is the meter by which the networks take the response from audiences and turn it back into new content. Yeah. She's not necessarily heartless. I mean, no offense, but she reminds me of what you just said about being practical and utilitarian. Yeah. When she sees that there's a cry for rage-filled programming and violence, she goes, I will supply that, and our ratings will go up. It's not if the audience was crying out for puppies and kindness, she would supply as much puppies and kindness as she could do to boost her career. Right. Yeah. And I guess the my response to that is, and I agree with you, is I think there's markets in everything, but that doesn't mean we want that to be the case.
There's got to be a human element.
Selling negativity is clearly what people want. Yeah. But it does actually hurt them quite a bit, I think.
This is why I say watch Succession, because I think Succession is the other half of this question, where it's tackling it from what is the human cost of.
Well, I think we see it actually now.
We see it there, but we see it from the producer's point of view, really, I'd say.
We also get Arthur Jensen's, though, so he's kind of the owner of the network, played by the Ned Beatty character. Right. He's in the movie for like 2 minutes, and he's wonderful. No, but he is...
The way that they write that part is really interesting to me. It bugged me the first time I watched it through, because I'm like, why is this so over-the-top dramatic? And then I realize exactly what he's doing. Right. Which is just kind of dialing into Howard Beale's wavelength, really, there.
And it's actually very manipulative. Yeah, because extremely. He's willing, and this is a kind of public choice theory angle of the movie, and I've never heard anyone talk about it this way. Arthur Jensen is willing to allow Howard Beale to do his shtick. The people at the network are like flipping out, like the ratings are tanking, right?
He's telling the truth that our network is corrupt. Our
network is... And Arthur Jensen's like, keep doing it. And because he knows how transaction costs work. Mm-hmm. So he's like, let the show tank, because tanking equals audience dipping out. And there's a kind of commentary in this movie about what I call the great forgetting. Like, people often say that history is cyclical. I agree for the most part.
Yes, it is.
And, and not that it needs to be, but that it has been. And so, like, it's a phenomenological truth, but maybe not a necessary one. And
I don't know.
We'll see. We'll get into this, but that'll be later. But with how the network goes, Arthur Jensen keys in on the fact that the audience, they will forget if you just allow the show to die. So they're not going to care about the corruption or the oil deal with the Saudis, which is like one of the big things. And he just understands media really well, in a way that the network programmers themselves don't. They're chasing ratings. Arthur Jensen, he's further out, and he's thinking about the further, like, how do you contain, something from the public? Oh, just make it not interesting.
Yep. The moment we're referring back to is also references an earlier point in the movie where Howard Beale is at home and kind of has what seems to be a nervous breakdown, where he seems to hear a voice.
Yes, I hear you.
That's telling him that something like that. Yeah, where he's supposed to go out and share his message, and he says, "Why me?" And the voice he thinks he hears says, "Because you're on TV, dummy." Right. Which is the same line that the owner of the whole network uses to manipulate him. Yes. Which makes me want to ask you, is Howard Beale crazy? Is he hearing voices? Because somehow that story has gotten Howard has somehow, I don't know if he does it in the script, say out loud that he heard a voice, and the voice.
Right.
I think he does.
I think he does.
Yeah. So So this is just the executive turning that back around on him, and it just happens to work cleanly and perfectly, almost like in a comic book. It's just a one-to-one, yes, I tell you that I am the voice, and I repeat what the voice said, then you'll believe me and do what I tell you to do.
Right.
So, is Howard Beale a prophet, enlightened,
Losing his mind.
the sort of deserves the kudos we would give like Jon Stewart today, speaking truth to power, or is he just crazy?
I personally don't think he's crazy. He strikes me as a kind of Nietzschean figure, actually, where Nietzsche becomes obsessed with this question of where do we go from here with our ethical systems. Now, you need not buy the whole Nietzschean package. I don't. But I think he's extremely instructive as a social commentator. He's actually more of that than a philosopher, in my opinion. And so he lines up a lot with Howard Beale in that he is speaking truth to, I would say, mass culture. And they just reject it, right? And I think if we can call him crazy, I think it's him just desperately actually trying to reach people. I think his attempts on the show are not showmanship. I think he's actually trying to reach people. Now we could call that crazy, but I think it's out of desperation, not out of some sort of mental illness.
That part is true, but then you get those scenes like when he's in bed alone.
Yes.
That's not for anybody. It does seem like he really seems to hear a voice. So.
No, I agree. And even Faye Dunaway's maybe he really is, enlightened in some way.
Or nuts.
Yeah.
Quick, let's put it on camera and make a profit off of his
Pretty
enlightenment.
Right.
Whatever it takes.
Yes.
I remember back during the early Obama years, people used to compare Glenn Beck to Howard Beale because he would have very similar on-screen breakdowns where he'd just get into sobbing fits.
Right.
And be like, we're all going to die, the world is ending. And I think it wound up in a very similar way there too, where he just got memory hold. Nobody thinks about him anymore.
But Glenn Beck was a piece of shit.
Yeah, for sure. But I think there was also kind of mentally he was not okay, and having him on there, it was tapping into the same kind of dark thing they're talking about in Network.
Yeah, I think that Howard, he's at a point in his life. I mean, they say it in the narration, which the narration of this movie, when it happens, is absolute beauty.
The absolute clinical tone of their narration, just reading off here's the share that they got today.
I found that really jarring.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay.
I think that's what they were going for.
When it happened more than once, I understood its functionality.
Yeah.
And that's fine. But I think this movie would also work without any of it.
It would.
It would. Yeah. I think it's trying to, maybe over the top, arguably, but trying to drive that same point home of here we are, we're chasing after this very mathematical equation despite the human cost.
On that point, I can give Network two very sincere compliments. With that very clunky narration, that feels like a Kurt Vonnegut move.
It does.
Oh, it does. Yeah, it totally does.
And then with the Howard Beale show and Susie, I'm going to get the names wrong, Susie the Psychic, and blah, blah, blah. That felt like a big old Firesign Theater sketch. This movie feels like somebody...
It does.
Took a Firesign Theater sketch and said, "No, let's really do it sincerely."
It does.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's watch everything fall apart, and everybody's cartoonish. By the end, Faye Dunaway's almost cartoonishly rabid about what she's doing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we just got to find a way to kill him. There's no
humanity there at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Utilitarian. It's what do we do next with Howard Beale?
Utilitarian without side constraints. Yes.
Yeah. Utilitarian without
conscience.
humanity.
Yeah.
Which just. Yeah. I mean, have either of you guys seen Bo Burnham's Inside?
I've heard of it. I've never seen it.
No.
That's a bummer because the further I got into it, the more I'm like, Bo Burnham's Inside feels like a 45-year later answer to the audience side of what Network is doing.
Is that the special that ends with him talking about going to Chipotle?
No.
Oh, okay.
This he made it during the pandemic and he slowly goes insane, but he also has a lot of songs about media consumption where he essentially accepts that it can be wonderful and terrible for you at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll probably drive you crazy, but what else are you going to do?
Yeah.
So,
no, what I like about Network is it is a little harsh on the audience, but it's funny the whole time it does it. So it's kind of like a good Kubrick movie where it's deep and it has these layers, but it's also entertaining. Hitchcock's that way too in his best moments, where it's not pure art house. There's actually a lot of like what a wide audience would like about this movie. But we have to say, would these shows do well if there wasn't an audience demand? I say no way. So people, and I think we're biologically programmed to kind of be negative, actually.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Right? We need to notice the tiger in the grass and not the pretty sun in the sky.
There was that Sony leak from 10 odd years ago where the Sony executive emails got hacked.
Right.
And like a third of it was just, God, I wish we didn't have to make more fucking Adam Sandler movies. Because like they hate them, but also they make a ton of money.
Yes,
so
they do.
Yeah, that's a lot of the entertainment industry in a nutshell. If you want to stay alive,
it's like Adam Sandler's just doomed to keep making mediocre retreads of his former work, almost like a kind of purgatory, which brings us to Jacob's Ladder.
Good segue.
Right.
Well done.
So this is Jacob's Ladder from 1990, directed by Adrian Lyne. It stars Tim Robbins and a whole bunch of other people. I'm not going to list everyone else in it, but it is kind of a who's who, a nice little time capsule movie.
Yes.
The synopsis is basically, after returning home from the Vietnam War, veteran Jacob Singer is haunted by flashbacks and surreal visions not of this world. And that was the most vague synopsis I could find that didn't lean into interpretation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And just stick to like, these are things you
That's
can
how
see.
I introduce it as well, right? Like, you don't want to give anything away of what the function is to the story.
Because that synopsis is not what the story is about.
Correct.
But you'd also have to go into it blind, I think, for it to work on you. Because
Yes.
if you go into it expecting to be kind of like I did when I was a teenager and saw it, like, okay, he's just dead at the end and none of it was real, and he woke up and it was all a dream. Is the original way that I interpreted that, and it cheapened it quite a bit.
I imagine that would. I'm glad I watched it later in life, actually.
Yeah.
Because I watched it, I was at least 25 when I saw it. So I didn't see it in high school or when I was younger. Because I watched a lot of R-rated movies before I was 10, but this was not one of them. And I probably wouldn't have appreciated it at all.
Right. And one thing I was referring to when I said, like, people on Reddit kind of not understanding the full concept of the movie, calling this a drug movie or like a Vietnam drug experience, an LSD kind of thing. And the little caption at the end.
That's the only flaw in the movie for me.
Thank you so much.
Is it?
Oh
I
my
think so.
goodness.
Yeah.
I would love to take that back too.
Me too.
For similar reasons, I suspect.
I watched a lot of behind the scenes. Fortunately, like in the 90s, it was keen to show you behind the scenes special effects specials. So
it's also so 1990 in the best way.
It is. But you had the writer and you had the director explaining things and like we'll tell you what it is.
Right.
And Adrian Lyne, he brought the whole Vietnam plotline to the script. It was not in the original script.
Right.
He brought the whole drug message thing to the script. And I went back and forth about how much I disliked those. I got into a thread of someone saying, you could have just cut the whole drug thing out of the movie because that was a red herring and it was distracting. But when I finished it and thought about it more, I realized distraction, red herring, is part of Jacob's experience.
Yes.
Absolutely. Is a thing.
It's a part of it's like a purgatory that he's in.
Yes.
It is literally a purgatory that he's in. Kind of like in After Hours. What is the thing that keeps this guy going to all these different scenarios?
Right.
Yeah.
For Jacob, it is trying to fight back, trying to struggle.
Right.
And everyone keeps telling him, if you just let go,
right,
you would get to move on,
yeah,
or then your pain would stop. But he's like, no, there's a struggle I need to finish. And that's why the drug thing works, because when he finds out that it's all true, you were drugged. That's why there was violence. That's what you experienced.
Right.
Yeah.
The problem is it's so easy to misinterpret that as he's hallucinating this whole thing.
Yeah, I definitely believe the way to understand it is allegorically, the drug portion of the movie.
Yeah.
It's an allegory for his acceptance, right? Because and this is not an M. Night Shyamalan movie. Now, the first of those movies are great. I really like the early Shyamalan, but they're very twist-oriented. This movie I've heard called kind of like a pre-Shyamalan twist movie, but I think that's a cart. I think that's a cart before the horse, because the twist in this movie is actually very unimportant. It's the journey that matters, not the end.
Yeah.
And
that's one reason that I love, because I looked up similar things, and the original script was much more, the demons were literal, like it was literally going through the 7 circles of hell.
Right.
It wouldn't have worked,
absolutely,
I think, that way.
You need the veneer of the Vietnam story.
And you need the bits like, oh, okay, you really were like drugged. This isn't on you.
Right.
Like, it all makes sense now. And then you need Danny Aiello coming in and like giving you a nice massage and a bag straightener.
And just telling him everything. Danny, I wrote down even the smallest quotes where he's like, hey, just relax.
Yeah.
Let go.
Yep.
Right.
Pain will go away. You can move on.
Right.
One funny thing about his chiropractic scenes is a fun little bit. Every time Danny Aiello says, all right, turn on your right. He goes, wait, nope, you're the right. I'm like, oh, cool. Jacob always turns to the sinister side.
Yes.
The left.
Oh, shit.
Yeah.
He was told to go right. Take the right-hand path here. And that is such a...
it's a nice detail.
But it's so minor.
Yes.
If you're looking for it and you find it, good for you. I hope you enjoy it. Mwah. But otherwise, it doesn't mean anything.
Correct. Yeah.
It's not like, oh my goodness, if he had turned right on the chiropractic table, then he would have gone to heaven. Macaulay Culkin would have just popped up out of the floor.
Yeah.
This is one reason why I really enjoyed the rewatch of it, is that when I read it in a very literal sense, I didn't like it at all. But when I read it more like Slaughterhouse-5 almost.
Absolutely.
That's, I think, what it reminds me the most of, where there's the war trauma in there, and there's that sense of time travel, but you're still trapped back in the horror and the trauma of the time. And yeah, I mean, I like to look at it on several levels. Like, part of that really happened, like he went all the way through so that he was able to talk to the guy who started the experiment that fucked him up and actually killed him. And then he went all the way back, which, like, you know, you can interpret it that way, and you can interpret it absolutely abstractly in terms of 7 levels of hell moving on toward death kind of thing.
Yeah.
I was watching this and I kept hypothesizing, what if the script had fallen into David Cronenberg's lap?
Oh, he loves Cronenberg.
I do love Cronenberg. So I don't think it would have been as well directed, but it'd be so weird and interesting, though.
Much better visuals.
Probably.
The visuals were intentionally obfuscated in this, and that's part of why I said at the beginning, like, you can really hate this movie if you want to, because his intention was to do the horror thing, like, oh, don't show too much, leave it to someone's imagination. I went, I'm seeing not a flapping of demon wings, I'm just seeing a fucking blur.
Right.
Like, oh my goodness, there's a tail there.
Yeah.
It makes sense to me that there's a tail there. You showed too much of the... Oh, a horn pops out of her mouth. Yeah, it seems like he's tripping out.
Right, yeah. And I think that's why the drug thing is needed, is because it can buttress against the actual... Again, I would take out the tagline at the end, because it's not needed.
Well, it also concretes it a little bit.
That's my problem with it.
Yes.
It justifies it when it's clearly not.
I don't want to have that clear solution.
It's there to show sympathy and draw attention to real things that happened.
Yeah.
To go back just a little bit, this would be the moment in Network where someone says, ta-da, something bad happened, be upset about this.
Right.
Except you put it in the wrong part of the wrong movie.
Yes. Of the definite wrong movie.
Where I'm watching this movie, I'm like, I don't think this is about the suffering of Vietnam vets. It's very convenient at the time it was filmed to make it about a Vietnam vet, and that we would all be able to associate, oh, maybe he's tripping out on LSD because that happened in Vietnam or in the 70s, 60s and 70s.
It did.
But it gives this experience the real world references for it to exist for a man.
And that's because he believes that that's how it is.
Right.
Yeah.
And then we can see, okay, this human... who would have had these kinds of experiences that I think I know about because I've seen movies. I saw Tropic Thunder, so I know what this is. And
pretty much.
Yeah, that's for us. That's not for the best of the film.
I agree. And there's a deleted scene that they cut out that I love.
Yeah.
And I would love to reinsert it just on my own time. It's when he actually takes the cure. Yeah. And this thing starts ripping itself through the ceiling trying to get him. Oh. And he's like he's not strapped to the bed, but it's like he's paralyzed.
Is that after he goes into the in the alleyway, asylum, the hospital thing where there's the limbs on the floor? Okay.
Right. And that actually leads me into 2 things I definitely want to bring up. First, Elizabeth Peña's performance in this I love.
Oh,
Yeah, she's great.
She has the wonderful like nails down his back in the bed.
She plays Jezzy, his
Yes,
girlfriend.
Jezebel, right? And
Like, let's be a little more blunt.
I know, right? And that's why I don't get people's literalist take of the movie. It couldn't be more clear. But she burns his pictures that he gets of his children.
Yeah.
Like she's trying to destroy his past in a way.
One reason you might dislike this movie is because the function of her character,
it is one-dimensional
in his trauma. Oh no, I was going to say it vacillates in so many ways. Like she does seem to be doing things to help him, but also seems to be like there in the insane asylum doctor's office and the director said she was put in that scene to see her aligned with the forces of darkness.
Right.
So it's hard to read like what she is at any given point.
Right.
Which makes me think that a misinterpretation of this movie would be to find individual characters and say, "Oh, this is an angel, this is a demon."
Yeah.
When the quote that this whole movie hinges on is that as you're dying, you will experience helpers stripping away your burdens,
and it will feel like devils tearing away at you.
If you hold on too bad, it'll feel like devils.
Yes.
If you're at peace, it will be angels setting you free.
Yes.
So at moments where maybe he is feeling at peace, she functions differently.
Right.
Because this is not an actual being with an actual agenda.
Yeah.
This is him experiencing either the illusion of him being stripped of his attachments or of helpers coming and him misinterpreting her motivations.
I love that.
Or she being presented to us as we're supposed to be empathizing with this character going on this journey.
I love that.
She's being presented to us in with vacillating motivations. Like she burns the stuff, which is meant to seem like the most bitchy thing.
Honestly.
Hey, your kid dropped off some photographs. Remember your time with
burn
your wife?
them.
Let me burn the photos of your dead kid.
Yeah. And I think oftentimes her version of comforting him, though, is often the opposite of her trying to help him accept that he's dying. It's like a prison of comfort, right? Because he gets to keep living the illusion with her rather than facing the light. And something I love also about this, and I don't know where this comes from in my life, and this is something emotional for sure. I love all the portrayal of men and tears in this movie. There's a lot of genuine male crying.
Yes.
Ving Rhames is super good in it.
Ving Rhames is so good.
And he has like almost a speakingless part, right? But it's so good. And
I want more stuff like that.
Me too.
Let guys cry.
It's interesting because it's cathartic without any real context, which I love. Like, of course, they're all Vietnam vets, but I love that there's not this big exposition scene. It's all just pure feeling. Yeah. And, like the best directors do that, right? Yeah. Like this is a visual medium. It's not a novel. Yep. And that works really well for me. Tim Robbins in the tub is awesome to me.
That stuck with me even when I watched it the first time.
Yes.
That was the only thing that I remembered. Right? And it's just like nobody's listening to him. They're just piling the ice on top.
Right.
That's horror movie material.
And as they're pouring the ice on him, it's like so cold that it's burning him.
Yeah, right? And like he's saying it, but his voice is so faint, and everybody else is trying to help by hurting him more. Yes. And it just
And he keeps. Whenever he tries to justify what's happening to him, it's an attempt for him to not accept, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So all the encounters with Jason Alexander, they're like, you never were a Vietnam vet. What are you talking about? And he's like, what? So all of his illusions are being shattered.
That moment too, I felt like they could have done a little bit more with.
I think so.
Of people saying you weren't even in Vietnam.
So I think that the big thing about Jacob's Ladder is. The whole idea of the way up to heaven is through the darkness of hell to the light, right? Like that's a bastardization of a quote from Seven, but
oh no, that fits.
But it does, and they came out kind of around the same time, very similar like art direction. Mm-hmm. But I actually think Jacob's Ladder is the superior movie, but I like Seven. But it's all about acceptance of your final destination, right? Like this is something that most humans will experience, possibly all of them. We'll see what future technology does for us. Maybe we'll all have mind uploads. But up until this point, everyone's experienced death. And acceptance probably is the only way to do it with any kind of dignity. And this is something I worry about with myself. Like, how much dignity will I have on my way out? Will I go kicking and screaming, or will I have this acceptance? And I wouldn't say I'm nervous, because regardless of what I do, it's going to happen. But I'm hopeful that I'll have the dignity. With silence, I think that the way of understanding silence is there are definite talks about colonialism, which we're going to get into.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also understanding people. This makes it kind of related to After Hours, actually, because even the concepts that are being talked in silence by the priests or the missionaries are not quite the same things that are aligned with the villagers.
Right.
And yeah, so I'm curious what you think about silence, actually, before we really get into it.
Well, just to let everybody know, we're talking about Silence from 2016, also directed by Martin Scorsese, and primarily starring Andrew Garfield.
Mm-hmm.
The synopsis is, in 1640, 2 Portuguese Jesuit priests traveled to Japan, where Catholicism has been banned and punished under the Tokugawa shogunate.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, the whole country had a ban against Christians and foreigners. Those
except for the Dutch,
being hand in hand. Except for the Dutch, you could trade.
Yes.
But they were coming down against Christianity.
Yes.
In terms of colonialism, that's how I approached the movie when I came into it. This is one that I hadn't seen before.
Right.
What happened was I ended up going down a deep, deep rabbit hole about the history of the area at the time, the history of missionary work by the Portuguese and Spanish, realizing that this was about colonialism in as much as the twin powers of trade and religion at that time. Every expedition like this did have to get somehow sanctioned by Rome, by the Catholic Church, endorsed by it. And to that end, if you were going to do trade, you had to bring the church with you.
Right.
They knew that if the church can get embedded in a place, it would make the people more sympathetic because they were Christians dealing with other Christians. The revenue from the trade would end up in the coffers of the church. So the church was making money doing everything from tea and weapons to human lives, because this was around the same time that the Portuguese and the Spanish were exploring West Africa, in like Angola and Benin. What I wasn't prepared for was sort of finding out of the Japanese history that this wasn't them pushing back to being colonized necessarily. This was sort of a gap in between shifting powers.
Yes.
Where these foreign entities, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, had kind of shown up with an opportunity.
Right. And
a lot of regional governments, the daimyos, were willing to kind of side with these outsiders because that could make them seem fancy, or give them more opportunities, or give them access to muskets and weapons that they didn't already have. That new ideas like Christianity could be a way to make their independent territory more cohesive for them.
Yes.
When they were fighting against other the whole feudal system and other neighboring leaders. But then about the time we get to our story, when the Tokugawa shogunate took over Japan, all of a sudden sort of a snapback, a pendulum swing back the other way, where there was now cohesion all over again. And so we're in that almost like an infection. And that's a funny way to look at these missionaries, as an infection, as a virus or something coming in, because on one hand, that's a foreign body that's interfering with the health of the body itself. But the reaction to this quote unquote virus is to expel it, kill it mercilessly,
including their own citizens,
because it was not just the foreigners. The foreigners were being pushed out, the tradesmen were being pushed out, the boats were being blocked, but the idea of Christianity. And I think that's what Martin Scorsese was really exploring.
Right. And there's also a lot in this movie, by the way, that was a very good introduction to this.
It really was.
There's a lot in this movie also about statecraft and state building, and how regular citizens typically are just told to stuff it and deal with it. The Japanese government at this time are not pluralist at all with their citizens.
Right.
Not only do they think that Christianity is a virus, but that Buddhism is going to be a state-enforced religion, right? So they are adopting their own kind of theocratic government, similar to the Portuguese had with the Catholic governance, right? And so you see kind of this mercantilism on both sides, where it's not quite free trade the way that I would like it. It's trade that is all under crown approval and crown sanction, and there's always strings attached. I would much prefer free trade. And yeah, there's a lot in this movie about how sticky culture is.
Right.
Can ideas even take root when you have so few overlapping similarities, culture to culture? And there's a thread in this where I think Scorsese, I know that he calls himself Catholic. Now, there are people that will say he is not Christian after making this movie, because one of the things he does in this movie is contradict a particular teaching of the Bible, which is, we'll get into sacrificing yourself to save people, because this is a big part of this movie. I think that the concept of ideology is talked about a lot in this movie, both politics, but especially just beliefs in general. What I love about this movie is Andrew Garfield comes as a spreader of ideas. He's a little bit naive to what he's doing,
and fully passionate about what he believes in.
Fully passionate. As he goes through the movie, I actually do think that he comes to realize that saving others while sacrificing your own belief system. So he's called upon to apostatize. He has to step on this plate of Jesus Christ, which is a wonderful visual tool.
Yeah, Fumi.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that was a real thing.
Yes.
That seemed so cinematic.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was 100% real. That's exactly how it happened.
Yes. Yeah, and it was a way of getting people, because, to relinquish your faith of something that you believe in, this isn't just some passing, belief of I believe eggs should be $3 instead of $4. This is deeply metaphysically ingrained in a lot of people, right? Back to the cultural stickiness. So if you're asked to publicly, show a visual display of renouncing your faith, it's an extraordinarily painful exchange that you're being asked to do.
Right.
This is exactly why I found this movie frustrating, though, the first time that I saw it, because I'm like, if it's reflective of the strictness of Catholicism. I think that he is so certain he is renouncing his faith by putting his foot there.
Well, keep in mind though, if the Japanese betray Buddhism, they get beheaded.
Sure.
So the strictness is on both sides.
But yeah, you could save so many lives by just putting your foot down and saying you're renouncing it without actually doing it.
And he eventually does that.
He eventually does, but he takes so long.
Eventually does it, yeah.
And
because
why?
Why is because of what we just said, stickiness.
Right, which is just insane to me. That's an aspect I think I will never fully understand. If you believe in an almighty God who is worth worshiping, I think he'd forgive you for that.
But then the great contradiction, the heart of this movie, God would of course forgive you for that, but at the same time, if you believe so strongly and know that your faith is the one true and only, you would not betray it.
Yes.
And honor it. And the thing that got me, that I really liked about this, was the Fumi is such a Japanese invention.
Absolutely.
Of just the public shaming.
Yes.
Seemingly without a loss of face.
Yeah.
Because loss of face is such a big thing in their culture, about if you can do a small thing to show that you are contrite, to show your humility, everything's fine. But it just shows that you've submitted to another power.
Yes.
And that's part of, I love that you're using the word sticky. Sticky is great. That's part of why Andrew Garfield can't do it, because this shows submission to the shogunate or to the Inquisitor in front of him.
Sure.
The Inquisitor, by the way, that actor,
he's awesome.
Blew
so great
my mind with him being such a delightful person, and then
doing the evil shit.
But he
very bureaucratic type of character.
That was Issei Ogata. He's done a lot of acting. In the behind the scenes video I saw, Andrew Garfield paid him this really great compliment of saying the guy didn't use very much makeup. They didn't have to, because as he got into character, he could just bend his face a little bit
Nice.
to seem older, to seem a little more frail, which is
Love that.
essential to that character.
Yeah.
He comes around as this kindly old man.
Yeah.
He doesn't show up at first as the enforcer, but it's just someone hanging out with the enforcer who offers water and is kind, which is another side of it, is that they don't have to be cruel to everybody.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
They just demand submission. Without that, then things get worse.
Right. There's no incentive like force, though, right? And
Yeah.
and you know what I love about this movie too, though, is I think Scorsese is more interested in portraying the tension of religious faith than
Right.
actually coming down on one side of the ledger.
Right.
And that's what I love about this movie so
Yes.
much, is it dramatizes the interconnection of faith and doubt.
Yes.
And I don't think that one can exist without the other, actually.
Yeah.
Like, if we live life in full doubt, how do we ever make a decision about anything? And then people that have nothing but faith, we usually think of such people as kind of blind. So, like, doubt is a kind of way of grounding your faith, actually.
Mhm.
That's how I read it. Now, I don't come from a religious background.
I
but-
do, and you're wrong.
Now, how I read the Gospels, I have not made it further than those. Like, I've read some of Romans, but I've not made it into the letters of the New Testament. As I take Jesus in the Gospels, this is a man who's actually demanding that you go through an ego death. A voluntary one, though. He's not about force. He's actually radically apolitical. And like in so many ways, he doesn't give a shit about what your politics are. Because he's like, what matters is your moral devotions, not
Mhm.
your political ones.
Mm-hmm.
So he's asking for something actually quite Buddhistic in my reading, which is
Yeah.
he wants you to be unattached. And if you read the letters of Paul in Romans, I think that's where it is. Paul essentially says, "There's nothing left of me that you could call Paul. I live in Christ." And the idea being that he has married himself so strongly to this ethical, metaphysical belief that there is no person left outside of that. There's no tension left. And I think that's what Garfield wants. And I think he finds it. But he finds it in a place that he doesn't expect, which is relinquishing his ideology.
Well, the argument you just made comes up in the movie.
Yes.
When he's at the Inquisitor's house.
Yes.
Well, and there's the interpreter.
Right.
The actor. I didn't make a note of which actor that was. Spelling out the similarities between Buddhism and Christianity.
Yes.
I mean, it is cherry picked,
Yes.
and that's tricky.
Yes. And of course, there is the whole history
Sticky.
of...
I'm sorry, sticky is the word. we're using.
There's a whole history of hidden Christianity in Japan as well. And the author of the book, because this is based on a novel,
He was Catholic.
he was Catholic.
Yep.
And he wrote a lot about it. And Silence just happens to be the most successful of those books. And so it's definitely not written by kind of your stereotypical white guy in the West. And that's, I think, what makes it so nuanced and interesting, actually, is it's coming from
Right.
It's filtered
not-
through this Japanese cultural lens.
It's not anti-Japanese.
It's not anti-Japanese.
And it's not Catholic.
Correct.
There's every reason to be anti-Portuguese.
Yes.
Don't get me wrong. The Portuguese and the Spanish at this time were bad people.
Right.
But the intention of the author of the book
Right.
is not on either side of the two groups that we are seeing in this movie.
Yeah, I think that a lot of what happens in the movie is the Garfield character kind of goes through his own version of an ego death. His ego is actually wrapped in to this tight
Right.
holding of his Christian faith. He realizes that he can actually preserve life by letting the thing that is most dear to him go. He goes through his kind of own transformation at the end. Now, he remains a Christian. He becomes a Japanese hidden Christian.
Yes.
And
Also some parallels with Jacob's Ladder there.
yes,
The idea of letting go of the things that speak the most to you.
yes. And then there's also a lot in this movie about the limits of forgiveness. So there's the kind of Judas character, Kakichiro, I think is his name. He is such a good character in this movie, I think, because he is absolutely the metaphorical Judas, right?
Right, and that was played by Yosuke Kobozuka. Watching behind the scenes stuff and seeing that guy not being Kichichiro,
Mhm.
oh my goodness, he's a completely different, I mean, as a good actor should be.
Yeah, that's
He's a
wonderful.
completely different type of person. I think he's also a director and a writer
Nice.
on top of being an actor.
Good for him.
He just showed up on set. I mean, this is my interpretation. He
Right.
just showed up on set like, I'm ready to do my job, and camera roll, okay.
completely different person.
Yeah.
That's
And-
the best.
And something I also love about this movie, now this is more personal on my end, is I'm someone who, I guess, on paper is agnostic,
Mhm.
but like C.S. Lewis, I do believe in the God-shaped hole in the heart of man, and what you put in there dramatically affects your life and how you are to people. Like some people stuff it full of nationalism, which is not what we should want, right? And we will get into Come and See with
Yeah,
that.
I was about to say that would be a
And-
great segue into Nazis and
Yeah.
Belarus.
And you could easily do the wrong thing. Like picking the right transcendental values is actually a very hard and important task because the consequences of it are large regardless of what direction on the meter they go.
Mhm.
And I'm someone who desperately wants to be religious. Like I fully understand that about myself and admit it. But I have yet to find a church that can hold me because I think the point is to be a curious seeker. And often what I see with organized religion is conformity, the stickiness. And I want to be like anti-sticky. I think here in the West, we're very tempered to be Christian oriented in our conversations,
Yeah.
regardless
Yes.
if you are or not a Christian.
Right.
But either if you're a critic or a supporter, that's the religion you go to. If we lived in the Middle East, we'd be talking about Islam being great or bad.
Yep.
And
React against the big thing.
I would
Right.
I would love to hear someone talk about silence through
Ooh,
a
Yes.
Muslim
through a
lens.
Muslim.
that would be really interesting.
Or yeah,
Yeah.
through a non-Christian lens.
Because it's so very Christian, and it's like strict interpretation. It feels like I don't think any other religion would really require you to do that in that way. I don't think.
There was some dialogue which I appreciated between Andrew Garfield's character and Adam Driver playing Adam Driver
Yes,
with some kind of accent.
that's true.
That comes and goes.
Because he was definitely the salt to
Yes.
to the salt to Andrew Garfield's sugar.
Yes.
He was definitely but also like such a strict adherent. Like he seemed like a badass who could bring the fire and brimstone, but he also threw himself into the water
Yeah.
to save
Yes.
Japanese Christians who were being forcibly drowned.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he tried to swim out and save them.
Yeah, it's a
Because-
deep act of universal love.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was not willing to give up his faith to save their lives,
Right.
but he was willing to give up his life
Right.
to try and save their lives.
And it's the
Yeah.
other side of the coin to Garfield.
Yeah.
He relinquishes his faith to save others rather than not relinquishing, right? I recognize these impulses in myself, and then I identify strongly with this movie because its main theme is the portrayal of struggle.
Yeah.
And I guess in this way I am Nietzschean, where I don't think you can get this without struggle. And now we're really going to be able to talk about Come and See with this.
Oh yeah, Come and See
Oh.
is from 1985. It was directed by Elem Klimov. It stars a fantastic young actor
Yep.
who's at the center of this. I'm going to try and get his name right. It was Alexei Kravchenko.
Yes.
A one-sentence synopsis of the movie, which is almost 2.5 hours long
Yeah.
and really cannot be summarized. You take in so much, but
Yeah.
basically it is in 1943, a Belarusian boy is conscripted by resistance forces and faces hardship and horror during the Nazi occupation of Belarus. I think this was the one you warned me about.
This was the one I warned you about, and I
Yeah.
did not rewatch it. One watching is enough for me for this one. It's seared into my memory. The whole movie takes place over, what is it, 2 days?
I
not very long.
think it's supposedly like a couple weeks.
Okay.
But the editing blurs it, which I think
Yeah.
is actually very effective.
Part of the point too, and I remember there's a shot near the end where they show the boy looking like he's aged a decade. Right?
Yeah.
He looks like he's a little old man at the end.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And that's half of that. Again, like the Inquisitor in Silence. Half of that is that boy's fantastic
Absolutely.
performance to contort his face with emotion
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
be transfixed by it. You talked about how long did this is a time period of the story.
Yeah.
I really kind of felt like I didn't manage to watch it all in one setting because I had to stop and take things in, but it felt like it was almost a oneer. It almost felt like it was a one shot.
It does.
It obviously was not.
Right.
Yeah.
There's so much about this movie. I
Oh,
think
God.
the first thing to note is, I'll agree with you. When people talk about great child performances, this is number one. Like, no doubt. Like, I love Haley Joel Osment. I have a soft spot for Edward Furlong in Terminator 2.
Mm-hmm.
And there's others too. But Kravchenko is absolutely amazing. He's acting at a peak that is beyond most adult actors, in my opinion.
Oh yeah.
And
They looked at hypnotizing him because they were worried about.
they were worried
traumatizing
about him. Yeah.
And he's just like, I'm just gonna act it out.
Yep. Come and see. You can see it as a coming of age story, confronting like the horrors of the world, right? Because there's this kind of Garden of Eden moment where he's with the young girl, and it's even filmed really surrealistically.
Yeah.
And as it goes forward, it becomes more real in every sense of that word. Like
Oh
big
my
capital
goodness.
R real.
Oh my goodness.
And like for the listeners, it's not particularly a bloody movie. It's not gory. I think what it is it's very visually visceral. It's very
Yes.
emotionally taxing.
That's
because-
actually-
oh my goodness, it
This
is
is why,
exhausting.
like, people say that ammunition was live, but I think that's why it needed to be live.
Probably.
Because there's
Yeah.
a way that
I agree that it is live ammo.
bullets look like they're real on screen, which you
Yes.
never see.
Because they used tracer rounds, so you could see the red
so you can
flashes.
see it, and on top of that, they're using proper uniforms.
Yes.
They're doing things that were actually done. Like their
Yeah.
entire approach is
Yeah.
realistic across the board, which is part of what makes it so hard to take, because it's not just fictional misery for the hell of it. It's stuff that people actually endure.
Oh, this is
Yes.
practically a documentary.
Yeah.
This is based on actual interviews with survivors
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
the Belarusian invasion by
And many
Nazis.
villages were torched like this.
Yeah.
which
People
is
were
just-
systematically killed. You know, and this
How
is
did
where
people not lose their minds?
Well,
like, and there's not much here in this movie about communism and the horrors that the Russians did to themselves in this era.
Right.
But something that I have read over and over is the communists would end up wishing their family members would starve on their side of the fence rather than go to the Nazi concentration camps. And one of the reasons that I've heard from Soviet economists is because the Nazis favored efficiency more than the Soviets did. The Soviet system was a kind of defragmented centralization. The Nazi one had much more ideological strictness. So in that way, there's a precision to like the annihilation of life. Whereas in communism, it's kind of this like soupy mess that happened.
I think
Well,
that's part of what makes it so hard to watch toward the end. It's just
Well, and
Yes.
and towards the end, there's a cinematic moment where the bad guy tells you exactly what his motivation was
Absolutely.
the whole time.
And it's
Yeah.
great.
Oh,
You don't
yeah.
have the right to exist, is what he says.
And, like, there's
Because
just no-
you're an infection. We don't want the idea of you
Yeah.
or your genetics
Right.
yeah.
because you're not German.
It's the
I'm
ultimate
just
movie of
like-
having sympathy for the other, I would say. I think this movie should beg its audience to not care about nationality and care much more about the human cost
Yeah.
Yeah.
and of nationalism.
Yeah.
And so yeah, the main character, he goes through this transformation. He volunteers out of naivety.
Oh, he's so happy.
He is so
when,
happy.
when they
There's
come
a
and take him
panning
from his
shot.
mother.
Yes, and there's a panning shot of
He
his
skips.
face. Yeah, and
He
he's like,
does.
he looks almost as if he's indoctrinated. Even though I don't think he quite is. I think it's naivety more than
He's
Yeah,
indoctrination.
yeah.
He's just young. He's a boy.
He's just a
He
boy
gets to do
thinking
the
that he's going to
war.
fight for his country.
Yeah.
And by the end, you know, his family gets annihilated without him even being able to say goodbye. And there's this also kind of an odyssey moment in the movie, and at the mid chunk of the movie is him kind of just wandering, because
Right.
he's experienced all this loss, and now he doesn't know like where to point the gun, so to speak.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of wandering moment, like the knights searching for the Grail almost.
There's a moment sometime after he gets conscripted. He's so happy. He's kind of walking along between one point or another. He accidentally treads on a bird's nest,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
you
yes.
see that he has also tread on some hatchlings.
Right,
Basically, killed off the youth
right.
before they've hatched, or just as they've hatched, like basically cutting off that generation
Right.
of that bird's
Mhm.
family. I did not realize at the time that was foreshadowing. I thought that was maybe just violence against
Right.
youth that would happen against him as a young person.
Right. And there's so much sportsmanship in this movie during the village massacre at the end, where the Nazis, like, it's clear that they're actually having fun.
Oh.
In the same way that, like, the rape of Nanking happened
Yeah.
from Japan to China.
Yeah.
And there's a moment where they tell the parents they're in the barn. So they lock these people in a barn
Yeah.
with their children. And they make them kind of a Sophie's Choice type offer, right? And yeah, we won't give everything away. I will say then after
I should probably do a trigger warning at the beginning of this episode.
Maybe,
yeah.
For a lot of reasons.
But
when awful things like that were happening, I thought back to Jacob's Ladder
yes,
and the idea of American troops going abroad, where there would be a lack of instruction, a lack of leadership, and they're saying just point them in a direction and cause chaos and cause destruction and to wipe out the enemy.
Just let them kill as many people as possible, women, children, what the fuck ever.
Because the Nazi troops we see in this, like you said, sportsmanship, freewheeling, they do seem like they're having a jolly day out, just being horrible.
They even have that beautiful
fascists.
shot of the Nazi who like laughs uncontrollably when all the burning is happening.
Yeah.
And I love that shot because of how manic it is. Like it just shows you the sheerity of the evil.
Yeah.
Well, and then later when the Belarusians managed to pin down and trap 7 or 8
underneath
Nazis,
the bridge.
they looked like scorned teenagers.
Yes. Because they know. They have to know at some level what's happening. Because we all have, I think, this built-in moral intuition of you'd rather have people treat you the way that you would like to be treated, right? So there are some movies that just have these great standalone scenes. There's this moment.
I was hoping you would get into this.
And this is spoiler territory for listeners. So they capture the Nazis underneath this bridge after the village is massacred. And the Nazis, no one's really wanting to take accountability for what happened. And the Russians are ready to just murder all of them. Belarusians, yes. And the Belarusian commander, he stops them from killing them. He says, no, you need to hear out these people and what they actually believe. So there's this kind of like tough love that he's giving to his own soldiers and own citizens of, you need to know what we're up against if you really want to do anything about this.
That these guys believe you need to be exterminated because, and they will say this, they say it literally.
They will say it under pressure even.
That you do not have the right, that some races do not have the right to exist.
Yes. Yeah. And there's a couple shots during this moment where our main character is wandering around and it like cuts to this woman in an airplane and she's eating like shrimp. And then it cuts to her later in the movie. The airplane's has crashed and she's dead and she's got like vomit coming out of her mouth or she's like about to die. And these are like knee-jerk, happening in your head. And I actually think that that's a directorial choice of we're supposed to feel disjunction from these like visuals because that's exactly what our character is going through. Your brain's just kind of firing randomly at certain points because of the amount of trauma and stress that you're enduring. Now, at the very end though, this movie has my absolute favorite sequence ever, which is the backwards footage moment.
Where he's shooting the propaganda
poster.
He's
shooting a propaganda poster of Hitler, and because it's the closest thing you can get to killing.
By shooting, he like fires a gun at it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And to set I think that is a great scene, but to set it up, one thing I liked about that was it shows that live rounds were used.
Yes.
And how low budget this was.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because it's just a glass framed propaganda poster of Hitler, seemingly floating on top of a puddle.
Right.
Yeah.
And our main character walks up and shoots the poster directly in Hitler's face. And it's funny that because now there's a hole in the frame and everything, that's where the water leaks up.
Yes.
And it kind of erases Hitler,
Right.
but the frame is still there, and it's perfect.
Yeah.
The hole was right there.
It's that
the
transference idea too, because they just killed the Nazis, so the bullets are now being traded back and forth, and yet,
right.
And then it does that beautiful rewinding the camera.
Yeah, there's
seeming to undo everything.
There's actual black and white footage. It's all done in rewind, reverse footage, and there's like Wagner and Mozart being played over it, and then eventually jazz. And it's going back in time from the Nazi invasion of Belarusia to like this early childhood picture of Hitler. And as we keep watching the footage roll in, reverse, it keeps cutting back to our character who's shooting this poster like just repeatedly.
Right.
And obviously it's this desperate like wish like can't we just take all this back?
Yes.
And I just want to stop it.
It's this emotional outpouring of I wish none of this had ever happened to me, or to any of us. And he stops shooting when the picture of baby Hitler with his mother is shown, and then he begins crying.
Yeah.
It's this wonderful moment of knowing this Hitler, for all the bad things that he's done, and I'm not an apologist in any way,
was at one point
he was corrupted along the way.
Yeah.
He did not start out this way.
He's still a person.
He is still a person underneath, and regardless of how horrible he became.
Yeah.
And there's a deep compassion in
Yeah.
that. Now, the Soviets wanted to censor this movie and block it. It took Klimov a number of years to actually get approval to make it.
Sure.
Yeah, I can't believe
Well,
that.
And he
That's
himself
at
was
all.
a
Yeah.
survivor of Stalingrad.
And I just want to say real quick, for that moment you're talking about with the rewinding,
Mm-hmm.
I think it speaks to our character's motivation that in his mind,
Right.
he's continuing to pull a trigger, continuing to unload on this picture of Hitler, erasing the man,
Right.
almost to the point of completion. But he's
You
not
can't
going to
kill an
kill the
innocent
baby.
kid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He sees that there's a limit. There's a limit
Yes.
in himself.
Yeah.
Otherwise, he
Which
would be
is-
one of those maniacs that ran through town.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing because, like, people ask all the time as a rhetorical, would you kill
Oh.
Hitler if you could? And I love how seriously this movie answers that question. Like, would
Yes.
you kill Hitler if he was 3 and adorable and fine? You
Right.
know?
Of course not.
Yeah.
That's cool.
That's the thing,
I would
like-
kill his great-great-grandfather.
Right.
And,
Make
Because we know
it's
nothing about him.
clean. Exactly.
yeah, it's
So that's, yeah,
a wonderful moral message.
yeah.
It also means that part of what I take from the movie is we should be very reluctant to apply the label of pure evil to any
Mhm.
group or individual, and recognizing that we all come from this messy soup of humanity.
Yeah.
The older I've gotten, the more I believe that life is messy. Now, that does not mean we can't make sense out of it, but it does mean that simple first principles often fail to be complete.
Nuance
And
is important.
Right. I know a lot of people who have quite black and white views of how the world is, and I think they often commit the David Hume problem of mistaking how things are for how they ought to be.
Mm.
And that is a mistake, and whenever people use political ends to take what is and bring it to what ought to be in their eyes, it almost often requires destructive force.
Mm-hmm.
And
So
it nearly always backfires too.
yes, there's unintended consequences, and I think that this movie, to not be emotionally affected by this movie, it'd be hard for me to relate to that person.
Mhm.
I do believe, though, that there is a beautiful message, which is, we should resist labels of pure evil, because that's exactly what the Nazis did to us.
Yes.
Right? Like, they label them as degenerate, that it's evil for humanity
Mhm.
to continue
Yes.
with this particular population left alive.
Yeah, it's an aspect that I think we've always left out of our conversations about Hitler. He is the epitome of evil. He's a complete monster.
Right.
We forget the humanity that got him there.
And it's easy to do that in a video game, where you just need mindless bots to kill.
Yeah.
Right? But
But like we have to remember that he's also a person.
I think that Come and See, though, it leaves us with a great message after all the horror. And I do think that the way it gets there is you don't get to true spiritual enlightenment until you touch hell. And if you want, you don't literally need to believe that. It could just be like you encountering the dark side of your own self. But you can't have moral knowledge until you've been pulled down to the bottom, in my opinion. Come and See allows us to experience the most incredible, in both senses of that word, cinematic tragedy without actually having to live through it yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that's the true power of art is
Yeah.
You get to experience things without actually experiencing them.
Right
And
on.
the way that art can do that, it's phenomenal.
Mhm.
Everyone should attempt to Come and See. I understand if not everyone can do it.
Sure.
Never again.
I would recommend folks give this little mini film festival of movies close to your heart
Yeah.
a try.
These
It's-
are some excellent movies. They're rough, but they're incredible movies. And the fact that we sat here and discussed them for 3 hours straight, and we could still go another 3 hours.
Oh, so
yeah.
much more.
To it. Yeah.
So I want to say thank you for being a part of the show. Thank you so much for introducing me to these movies.
Of course, thank you
really
for
fun.
having me. It's great network effects that we have that I even
Fuck
met you. And I guess I would say to listeners, thank you for putting up with an ADHD talkaholic.
Auntie.
Oh, and and I would also say, be willing to maybe it came through when I was talking that I'm a fairly upbeat person,
Mhm.
but hopefully, but dark art can, you should not shrink away from it. If you want to be like a useful person when times get rough,
Yeah.
you should have some familiarity and knowledge about this.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, I think that this kind of art is very, very important.
I couldn't have
And-
said it better.
Thanks, man.
You're welcome.
Oh my goodness. Well,
All the smushy notes.
I think, yeah, on this squishy note, I think this has been a great conversation. We've been
Yeah.
through a lot. We've been through our own little.
Yes.
So thank you again. Thank you to everyone for listening, and we'll see you all again next time.